So we talked about subtleties, and now we're going to move into the advanced section and talk about advanced subtleties.
Yeah. Well, now that you know more about influence tactics than most people, it's time for the next level. After this podcast, you will have added to your repertoire of persuasion knowledge. I'm going to give you just a little bit of many things. I don't expect you to take these away from you in your long-term memory, but you can always revisit this podcast for things that you might want to be reminded of. One of the best ways to create attitude change or influence people is to create an inconsistency. Remember how we want to have consistency among that affective, behavioral, and cognitive components? We want consistency between our attitudes. How many times have you in your relationships pointed out to somebody that they were being inconsistent in what they said or inconsistent in what they're doing? And your purpose was to make them aware of the inconsistency, so hopefully they'll go your way. It doesn't always go your way. I had a really good friend who had been with a lady for a few years, and she started giving him a hard time. Things weren't going really well in the relationship, and he said to her, "You know, if you loved me, you wouldn't treat me this way." She was quiet for about a minute, and she said, "You know, you're right. I don't love you anymore." So there could be two sides to this one.
Wow.
Another persuasion tactic is should you tell people ahead of time you're going to try and influence them? It may make you look honest. I'm going to meet tomorrow's meeting. I'm going to convince you why we need to take my project over these others. I don't recommend that you forewarn people ahead of time of what you're going to do. It may make you look more honest, but it gives them a chance to get their defenses up and think about all the reasons why they don't want to change. Another little subtlety is inoculation. Like when you go get a flu shot, they're putting a little bit of flu in you. You go get your measles vaccination, they're putting a little bit of measles in you. Well, what you can do in persuasion is you can inoculate people against the next speaker. You have to be going before the speaker for this to happen. But you might say, my learned opponent's going to come out here in a few moments, and he or she is going to say this, 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 and this. Well, let me tell you what's wrong about their position. You don't have to talk about everything when you do this. You just say, but this one is wrong, this one is wrong. If I had more time, I could explain to you how much in error they are. So you have inoculated the audience against counter propaganda by giving a little bit of what they're going to talk about and refute it. Another thing you want to keep in mind is what's called the primacy-recency effect. Primacy refers to what's going first has a greater influence merely because it's first. Recency is going last is more effective merely because you went last. So which one works the best? Well, the answer is they both work. What you don't want to ever do is have your presentation be in the middle. If you're at work and you want to sell your ideas, you want to go first or you want to go last. If you're on a job interview, you'd like to be the first one. And if it looks like you're not the first one, ask if you can please put it off and you can come in and be the last one. A good friend of mine got the presidency at a university because he said his wife was sick when he realized he was in the middle of 5 interviews and he came in as the 5th one. I can't say that really happened, but I know it didn't hurt him. Should you present only one side of the message, or should you present that there's 2 sides? Well, if you're dealing with an educated audience who's going to be aware that there's a side other than your position, it probably is a good idea to present both sides and do some inoculation if you can. But if you're dealing with people that don't know the issue or aren't really bright, don't clutter their little minds. Just give them one side. Here's one of my favorite ones. The overheard or the overseen communication. If I'm talking to you directly, you may decide I am actually trying to influence you. But suppose you overheard me saying something about this is really the best position to take. I wish people would realize this. It's going to be beneficial to them in the long run and to the company in the long run. That's more effective than me saying it to you flat out. Even Shakespeare is full of overheard communications. If I want to praise you, how would it like if you overheard me talking about what a great worker you were? You can allow yourself to be overheard. And you can manipulate people by getting your message across without them even realizing that it's directed at them by allowing them to overhear you. You can also allow things to be seen, something that they thought they weren't supposed to see. You can leave a memo on your desk that the nosy secretary is going to see and blab to everybody. And that's a way you could test the waters to see if it's a good idea or not. If you find people are in revolt, you can deny the message because there was never a message that went out. And if it looks like something everybody wants, you could say, well, it's hard to keep a secret around here, but as you all know, we're going to go to this particular policy, this particular work week, or we're all going to get this particular raise. Another thing that's important to realize is if you appear to be arguing against your own best interests, if you appear you have nothing to gain, it makes you more effective because people aren't defensive because they see it's not in your interest yourself for this to happen. One of the best things Robert Cialdini talks about in his book, he was working as Robert in a French restaurant in Phoenix and trying some stuff out. And when he went to the table, whatever the first person ordered, he would say, he'd look both ways and say, well, the poached salmon isn't really that good today. Might I recommend? And then he would recommend something that was cheaper. Well, that made him look honest, right? Because that's affecting the tip. And then he would say something like, might I recommend a wine to go with this? And then he would recommend a more expensive wine than maybe usual, but because the people already trusted him, they would order that wine, the bill was bigger, and he would get a bigger tip. So appearing to argue against your best interests makes you more believable. Framing the request. Framing the request. Giving people something to compare it to. For example, I'm offering you this deal, other people don't get this deal. Or you show someone, I could have done this to you, but instead of doing this to you, I'm going to do that. And then you find yourself thanking the person. Like, for example, you might get stopped by a trooper who's going to give you a ticket because you were going 80 and a 50. And he says, instead, I'm just going to put down that you were going 58. And you find yourself thanking the trooper because you realize what he actually could have done to you. So, I remember a letter that somebody wrote that talked about all these horrible things that had happened to them. They had this terrible disease, and they'd run out of money and stuff, and it was to their parents. And after listing all these awful things, they said, well, none of this is true, but I wanted to let you know that I actually was flunking 2 classes, and I wanted you to put that in the proper perspective. So oftentimes when you frame things, you can frame things to a current situation or to something from the past. Back in the past, we would have never let this happen, but now we're going to let this happen. One of the very sophisticated techniques that you can research on your own is called the foot in the door technique. And what the foot in the door technique is, if I want you to do something for me, let's just call it a favor, I increase my chances of you doing that for me if I first ask you to do me a small favor first. And there's lots of research on this. It's a well-documented function. You ask for a small favor first, and then maybe you let a period of time pass, then you ask for the larger favor. For example, you might, if you're taking a college class and you haven't been there for a while and you really like to see somebody's notes, you get to class, you might ask them if you can borrow a pencil or a pen. And then when it's over, at the end of the class, say, listen, can I borrow your notes for the weekend and copy them or take them to the library right now? Oftentimes you will see reciprocity phrased this way. Like you might go to buy a car and the car salesman says, hey, listen, let me do you a favor. Can I get you a Coke or something like that? And you say, yeah, well, you just agreed to letting them do you a small favor because of how it was phrased. Are you more likely to buy the car? Probably. The next one I want to talk about are fear appeals. Fear appeals are pretty interesting, and the literature is not exactly solid on it. There's some literature that shows that fear appeals don't work. For example, if fear appeals worked, would anybody drink and drive? Okay. Would anybody smoke cigarettes or chew tobacco? Would people not practice safe sex? I mean, think about it. If fear appeals work, would people take better care of their health? You can't watch commercials between TV shows, but a constant menu of fear appeals. And one of the things that happens that I didn't mention earlier is you keep harping on something over and over again, people get reactance. They don't want to hear it anymore. So they're going to actually not do what you want. The other thing that can happen is you become so adapted to it, you don't pay attention. Adaptation is almost the enemy of persuasion. Think about the first time somebody told you they loved you. That really had an impact. How about the 100th time they told you that? Or the 100th person? By then you always know that you're lovable. On the other hand, fear appeals appear to work because political elections sometimes are won by people who are telling you all the awful things that will happen if they are not elected, or if you don't do what they want them to do. So just be careful with fear appeals. You want to be aware of the impact that they're having on you, and use some logic as to whether or not you think these things could really happen. And the final thing for this section is something that I don't have time to give you all of in this course right now, but it's called emotional labeling. If you think about it, we're capable of a lot of different emotions, but I would assume you've had a biology course along the way, or you wouldn't be in this podcast right now. There's not a distinct biological state for each emotion. It's not like they could take your blood and tell whether you were jealous, whether you were envious, whether you were experiencing mirth, or whether you were happy. There's basically two major states with the hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. The fear and flight. And so basically what happens with emotions is there's an arousal in your system, and you get to label what it is. If you decide it's happiness, it'll be happiness. If you decide it's fear, it's fear. I once heard that a coward and a hero feel the same thing. They just respond differently. So if you're in a bad mood, everybody can make you angry. If you're in a happy mood, the world becomes a bubbly place. I have a lecture I gave years ago called Love Does Not Exist, Romantic Love, unless the lover defines it as such. If a person creates an arousal in you, or you credit them for the arousal, and you decide you're in love, you are, because you will unleash your love scripts. If you decide it's not love, maybe that person makes you feel creepy. Whatever it is, you will not unleash your love scripts. So whether or not you're in love with somebody depends on how you label it. There's some people that fall in love once, and that's it. Other people fall in love 5 or 6 times a day. And you laugh at that, but basically if they label it as love, it is because they will unleash their scripts. Well, I hope you found this topic as fascinating as most people do. You're now a graduate of this mini course. Now that you have an edge over virtually, catch that, virtually, anyone else, remember to be ethical. How do you plan to use this knowledge in your future career? I'm going to go back to what I introduced by saying it to you again. Whether we consciously realize it or not, we are constant recipients and the source of influence attempts every day. Pop-ups on your smartphone, product placements in TV and movies, signs along the roadway, and so very much more are aimed at us all day long. We try to influence others to our wishes and ways of thinking as well. This pod course gave you a winning edge from personal lives through business success. Use it or be used.